Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. This is a fun episode I put together for you today. I call it 70 Celebrities Who Have Seen UFOs. There's actually more than 70, it's about 77, and some of these celebrities have more than seen UFOs. They've had face-to-face contact with ETs or been taken on board. You've probably heard of almost all of these celebrities. They're very famous, but I'm sure that some of these celebrities you did not know have had encounters. There are several reasons why I wanted to do this episode. One is because I think people are fascinated by celebrities, very interested in what they have to say. They have a lot of influence, so I think it's important to know that they have seen UFOs. It's important to share their stories. I also think it's important because the fact that so many celebrities have had encounters shows that the ETs display no prejudice on who they contact. They contact people from all walks of life. And another reason I wanted to do this video is in honor of Timothy Greeneckley. Timothy Greeneckley is a pioneering UFO investigator who recently passed away, and he's really one of the first who wrote about celebrity encounters in any depth. He wrote an excellent book called UFOs Among the Stars, which I highly recommend. Several of the accounts in this list come from Timothy Greeneckley directly. However, since he wrote that book, many other celebrities have stepped forward and revealed their encounters. In this list, I include actors and actresses, singer-songwriters, and sports stars, pretty much exclusively. And there are a lot of them. This list is alphabetical, so I'm going to start with A and work my way down through the alphabet and talk about all these celebrities who have bravely stepped forward to share their encounters. And the first celebrity I'd like to talk about is Dan Aykroyd. Dan Aykroyd is perhaps best known for starring in Saturday Night Live, the late-night comedy series. He's also been in a ton of movies, such as Coneheads, which was about ETs, so that's appropriate here. But Dan Aykroyd has also gone public with his own UFO encounters. And in fact, he's been a strong UFO advocate for years, and even hosted a 1990s paranormal series called Psi Factor. And as Dan Aykroyd says, in his own words, he has seen UFOs. And I quote, "I have seen 4, and I can't say that they are alien craft, and neither can the Air Force. The Air Force has been very interested in this. They don't deny the existence of the hyperdynamic, super aerodynamic craft. They don't deny." Dan Aykroyd says that what he saw were, quote, "definitely aerial constructs of some kind." On one occasion, he said one of these objects hovered directly overhead, right above him. So he had a close-up sighting, but he has not gone into great detail about what he's seen, but he certainly discussed the subject many times, and he has theories on why the government continues to cover up UFOs. As he says, "I believe that there are probably many species coming and going, and that the Air Force is very interested, but they can't come out and say, fearing it would provoke a complete breakdown of society." So that's Dan Aykroyd's story. Next celebrity I want to talk about is singer-songwriter Ryan Adams of Whiskeytown. On July 11th, 2013, Ryan Adams was driving near his home in Glendale, California. This was around 11 p.m. when he saw police cars and helicopters actually chasing an object through the sky. As he says, "This thing was huge. If it was a blimp, then that was an effed up blimp. Whatever I saw was like a real sci-fi film come to life. Choppers in the air near it. What is that thing?" He wasn't able to get a pic because he didn't want to grab his phone while he was driving. But he's absolutely convinced that he saw something. He did receive some trolling as a result of going public. But as he says, in response to the trolls who don't believe him, every person that sees something whack and unidentified aren't on drugs. Crawl back into the caves, Cro-Magnons. So, yeah, some of these celebrities have been ridiculed as a result of going public, but many, many have still stepped bravely forward and revealed their encounters. One of the most famous people ever to reveal his UFO encounters is none other than Muhammad Ali. He really needs no introduction. He was originally called Cassius Clay, but changed his name to Muhammad Ali. And yeah, he's super famous. And thanks to Timothy Greeneckley, who interviewed Ali, we know that Muhammad Ali has had many, many encounters. One of his encounters occurred in 1970 while he was in New York jogging very, very early one morning. And as Muhammad Ali says in his own words, I happened to look up just before dawn, as I often do while running, and there hovering above us was this brilliant light, hanging as if by an invisible thread. At first I thought it was a beacon projected from a helicopter, but moments later a similar object passed in front of us. I brought it to the attention of my trainer, who was standing nearby. We watched them come from behind the skyline and move slowly across the sky for at least 15 minutes. The best I can describe the sighting is to say they were just round and big. Muhammad Ali later found out that there was another witness to that sighting, who, as he says, was a pilot about to land at Newark Airport. Further research actually revealed that there were a number of people who sighted objects on that evening or that morning. And that was not Muhammad Ali's only sighting, not even close. He says he's seen them many times. On another time, he had a large cigar-shaped object pass right over his vehicle. This was probably his nearest sighting. As Muhammad Ali says, the closest happened when a cigar-shaped ship hovered briefly over a car I was a passenger in one night driving north on the New Jersey Turnpike. What a sight it was! We could see the shadow made by the UFO as it passed over the pavement of the road in the light of the full moon. On another occasion, he saw another cigar-shaped craft, as he says. At first I thought this flicker was the North Star rising in the heavens. However, within moments, I could tell I was watching something out of the ordinary. Before I could blink my eyes, this light had come down toward the mountains until it hovered right above the valley here. I knew I couldn't be dreaming. Sure enough, it was still there. This had to be one of those big ships they talk about. The UFO was streamlined and shaped sort of like a cigar, but blunt on both ends. I couldn't see any windows or anything, but I'm certain there must have been people on board. The very next night, he saw the same or a similar craft, and on this occasion, he had his skeptical business manager, Gene Kilroy, with him. Kilroy had told Muhammad Ali, when they discussed UFOs, that Muhammad Ali must be imagining things. But on this occasion, Gene Kilroy actually saw the UFO himself and changed his position on the subject, saying, and I quote, "There was something mighty peculiar happening over the camp that night. I looked up and saw this thing, this UFO, doing acrobatics up among the stars. The sighting changed my previous opinion concerning UFOs." So Muhammad Ali has probably, or at least claims to have seen more UFOs than any other celebrity I'm aware of or who has gone public. Muhammad Ali says that he has had no less than 16 sightings. So yeah, apparently he's in contact with UFOs, because if someone is having that many sightings, I think it's more than coincidence. And he's not the only celebrity. There are so many. The next person I'd like to talk about is actually another sports star. His name is Gareth Bale, and he's a football star from Wales. And he is absolutely convinced he saw a UFO. As Gareth says in his own words, "There are 100% aliens. I'm 100% sure of that. I saw a UFO myself. I actually have. Once. I actually have. Aliens exist, and the evidence is everywhere. There is solid evidence. People just need to look at them. The U.S. government has released photos and videos of the flying objects. There are aliens. It can't be fake. Aliens really exist. I definitely saw a UFO once." He didn't go into detail, but as you can see, he's absolutely convinced he did see one. And another very famous person who claims to have seen UFOs is the singer Victoria Beckham. And she actually says she photographed a UFO. She is, of course, Posh Spice from the Spice Girls. And she says that she saw and photographed a UFO hovering over her home in Beverly Hills. This was on October 29th, 2011. And she saw this very bright globe of light and photographed it. You can see that this object is very bright, casting a light on the trees below, which makes it look like it's fairly close to the ground. She tweeted about it, tweeting, "UFO hovering above our house last night," and says that she's not the only one who saw it. She, like many celebrities, did receive a lot of ridicule, people telling her, that's just the moon you photographed. Only I think she knows for sure. She was the one who was there. Other people weren't. So I don't think it's fair to judge unless people have actually investigated the sighting themselves. At any rate, she is convinced she saw a UFO. But in Victoria Beckham's defense, it was not a full moon on that night. In fact, it was just a thin crescent moon, so it couldn't have been the moon. I don't know. You can see the photograph yourself and make up your own mind. Another celebrity who has seen UFOs is none other than David Bowie, who really needs no introduction. He's mega famous. And David Bowie claims to have had multiple UFO sightings. He was a much younger man, and at that time was working for two gentlemen who were UFO researchers. And over a period of a year, he had multiple sightings. Sometimes nightly, he would see multiple objects, and on one evening he says, up to 6 or 7 objects. He was actually viewing these objects from an observatory. And he said that it was absolutely incredible what he saw. As David Bowie says in his own words, "I used to work for two guys who put out a UFO magazine in England about 6 years ago. And I made sightings 6, 7 times a night for about a year when I was in the observatory. We had regular cruises that came over. We knew the 6:15 was coming in, and I would meet up with another one, and they would be stationary for about a half an hour, and then after verifying what they'd been doing that day, they'd shoot off." So yeah, he's had multiple sightings and is absolutely convinced he's seen UFOs. Another very famous person who didn't go public with encounters but was actually outed by someone else is Johnny Carson, the late night talk show host. Johnny Carson never admitted to seeing UFOs. But according to drummer Buddy Rich, who was Johnny Carson's friend, Johnny Carson called him up one evening and admitted that he had seen UFOs. He told Buddy Rich, and I quote, "I just saw one." At the time, Johnny Carson was in a hotel in Las Vegas. And he told Buddy Rich that he saw a UFO. He said, "It was real bright. I was standing on the diving board, ready to plunge into the pool, when this brilliant light passed overhead, traveling at outrageous speed." According to Buddy Rich, Johnny Carson told him that this object was in view for about 40 seconds before just darting away. Unfortunately, Johnny Carson never went public with this, so we'll just have to take Buddy Rich's word for it. But if true, it's an incredible sighting. Another person who has gone public, another celebrity, is Charo. Charo is a dancer and actress. She appeared on The Love Boat and many other television series. And according to Charo, she says, and I quote, "I was in Murcia, Spain. That's my hometown. I was a little girl. One evening, while I was out in the back of the house, I happened to look up at the sky, and there passing overhead was this shiny object. It was really big, bigger than a star. Holy Chihuahua. I thought, what is this? It hopped in the sky like a Mexican jumping bean. I was very impressed, so much so that I have never forgotten what happened." There are so many celebrities who have seen UFOs. It's really quite shocking. Another celebrity who has seen UFOs is none other than rhythm and blues star, the funk musician, George Clinton, who had an amazing encounter on a deserted Toronto highway in Canada. This was during the wee hours of the morning, and along with him was the James Brown bassist, William Bootsy Collins. And Bootsy was driving. When they saw, it was dark, they saw this bright beam of light, which came down from above them. And looking up, they saw this object, and this beam of light actually struck their car 3 times. They said it was shiny and gold looking. It completely freaked them out. They at one point started to really get scared, and George Clinton turned to Bootsy and said, quote, "Do you think you can step on it?" And that's when Bootsy also felt a little bit of a flash of fear. What's very interesting about this encounter is it looks like they had missing time, because when this object first appeared, there were other cars on the road behind them. They saw this other car. This beam of light hits them. The next thing they know, this other car is gone. And they're looking at the streetlights, which are now coming on. So it was as if hours had passed, or there was some sort of time distortion. It looks like they had missing time. They did actually talk about this encounter on video on YouTube. You can find it on YouTube. So yeah, it looks like George Clinton had a missing time UFO encounter and was struck by a beam of light from a UFO. Very interesting. And so many people have bravely stepped forward. One person who allegedly had an encounter is someone who is called the most trusted man in America, none other than the newscaster Walter Cronkite, who allegedly saw a UFO during a rocket launch out in the South Pacific. But I'm not going to go too into this sighting because after doing some research, I'm not so sure that it's a reliable account. It comes from researcher Bill Nell, a UFO researcher who is now quite controversial. There are a number of people who think he actually hoaxed this whole account. And Walter Cronkite certainly never stepped forward saying he saw a UFO. I just wanted to let people know that I am aware of this claim that Walter Cronkite saw a UFO, but I just don't know if this report is reliable enough to really trust. So I am including it here just briefly, but I'm going to chalk this one up as an unknown. One person who's very famous, who has claims to have photographed a UFO, is Russell Crowe, who probably became best known for his role in the film Gladiator, but has since become very famous for a number of movie roles. And Russell Crowe is absolutely convinced he photographed a UFO. As he says, "A friend and I set up a camera to capture fruit bats rising from botanic gardens. This was a big surprise." And he shows this photograph, which appears to show an unknown object. This occurred on March 6, 2013. And some people claim that this photograph does not show a genuine UFO, but Russell Crowe is sticking to his guns and believes that he photographed an actual unknown object. So here's the photograph. You'll just have to make up your own minds about it, but Russell Crowe believes that it's a genuine UFO. Someone who has made a big splash lately for going public is actor and musician Miley Cyrus, who rose to fame for her role as Hannah Montana, the Disney series, but is now a world-famous musician and the daughter of Billy Ray Cyrus, famous for his song Achy Breaky Heart. At any rate, Miley Cyrus is convinced she saw a UFO and actually saw occupants as well. As Miley Cyrus says, "I was driving through San Bernardino with my friend and I got chased down by some sort of UFO. The best way to describe it is a flying snowplow. It had this big plow in the front of it and it was glowing yellow. I did see it flying, and my friend saw it too. There were a couple of other cars on the road, and they also stopped to look. So I think what I saw was real. And I did see a being sitting in front of the flying object. It looked at me, and we made eye contact. And I think that's what really shook me, looking into the eyes of something that I couldn't quite wrap my head around." So yeah, she thinks she actually saw ETs face to face. I find it interesting because there are an awful lot of celebrities and musicians that claim to have had contact with UFOs. I am not so sure this is a coincidence. ETs seem to love creative people, artists, musicians, writers, teachers, doctors, environmentalists, social rights workers, human rights, animal rights. These are the people they're very interested in, people who are doing good work for humanity, trying to enlighten humanity. And that's certainly true of musicians. Interestingly, Miley Cyrus's father, Billy Ray, also believes in UFOs and thinks he actually photographed some. These glowing sort of orb-shaped objects during a beautiful sunset. Hard to say for sure, but here we have two musicians, father and daughter, who both believe they have had UFO encounters. Another celebrity who some of you may not have heard of, especially if you're young, is Vic Dimon, but he's actually a quite famous singer. And in 1953, he was at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, at a drive-in theater when he saw a UFO. I found this really interesting because there are a lot of cases of UFO sightings at drive-in theaters. I wrote a whole book about it. But at any rate, Vic Dimon was at this theater when he saw an incredible UFO. And I'll just quote him briefly about what he says he saw. As Vic Dimon says, and I quote, There was this peculiar glowing thing in the sky. Here was an object that stayed overhead for 6 or 7 minutes, and when it did disappear, it left a trail that could be seen for quite some time. It was not a meteor. It was just too bright and lasted too long. And as far as he was concerned, it was much more interesting than the movie. Another very famous person who claims to have had a UFO encounter is Baron Davis. Baron Davis is a basketball star. He has worked for a number of different teams, the Hornets, the Warriors, and the LA Clippers. But he says he also had a UFO encounter in July of 2013. He said he was driving back from Las Vegas. This was during the wee hours of the morning. It was about 4 a.m. when he saw a bright light ahead of him that he at first thought was a truck. But suddenly he was disoriented, had a memory lapse, and the next thing he knew, he was not in his car, and in fact said he was being poked by, quote, half-human, half-ugly MFers. His next memory was being 4 hours away in Montebello, and he had no idea how he got there. As Baron Davis says, in his own words, I was actually abducted by aliens 2 weeks ago. I saw this light, and it's a big truck. And I said, oh, this is going to be traffic. I was driving, and the next thing you know, there's a steel thing, and these crazy-looking people, half-human, half-ugly-looking MFers. They were poking me on the nose, looking at my eyes. They had my hands tied, and the next thing you know, I was in Montebello, dude, burning rubber on the way back to LA at 4 o'clock in the morning. They were poking me on my nose, Ann S. They were poking me on my nose, and they were looking at me in my eyes. They had my hands like tied up. So he's convinced that he was taken on board a UFO and probed by aliens. And he's not the only one who's had this type of encounter. Another person who had a really dramatic sighting is one of the most accomplished entertainers in the world, Sammy Davis Jr. He's a triple threat. Sammy Davis Jr. is a singer, an actor, and a dancer. Was part of the famous Rat Pack with Frank Sinatra and other guys, Dean Martin. And Sammy Davis heard about UFO sightings going on in California, and he really wanted to see them. And he did. He's one of the first really big celebrities to go public with his sightings. In August of 1952, he heard about these sightings going on in Palm Springs, California. And as he says, I wasn't to be left out. And he went there and went looking for UFOs and actually saw them. He saw a number of small silver discs, which he says appeared and, quote, floated overhead. And as he watched, they performed incredible maneuvers, proving to him beyond any doubt that they were actual spacecraft. As Sammy Davis Jr. says, first they would stand still, and then they would take off and stop again before finally shooting away in a flash. I feel quite strongly that if they wanted to harm the human race, they could have done so long ago. So he feels that they are absolutely benevolent. Another musician who has gone public and received quite a bit of ridicule, but has really had a profound effect on this field, is Tom DeLong, the star of the musical group Blink-182. He actually left the group so he could pursue his UFO research. And he formed, of course, the To the Stars Academy and is really trying to push this subject forward. And this is apparently because of his own encounters with the phenomena. He had a really incredible encounter, he says, up in China Lake, California. As he says, and I quote, "I saw some really anomalous stuff one night out in the desert, zipping across the stars, horizon to horizon, zigzagging. That really blew my mind because no satellites move that way. But I can tell you what it was. I think, like most people, the stuff that I've seen is a lot of stuff on the internet where I bet some of it really is true, but you really don't know which pieces." And Tom DeLong says that he has had actual face-to-face contact or communication with ETs on another occasion. As he says, "I woke up right around 3 a.m. My whole body felt like it had static electricity. And I opened my eyes, and the fire is still going." He's out camping. "And there's a conversation going on outside the tent. It sounded like there were about 20 people there talking, and instantly my mind goes, okay, they're at our campsite. They're not here to hurt us. They're talking about stuff, but I can't make out what they're saying. But they're working on something. Then I close my eyes and wake up, and the fire is out, and I have about 3 hours of lost time." So here we have another person claiming to have been abducted by ETs, another very famous celebrity. Another very famous person who claims to have had a UFO encounter is Melinda Dillon. You might not recognize her name, but you absolutely do know about her. She starred in the movie A Christmas Story, and also had a starring role in the movie Close Encounters. She was the one whose little boy had been taken on board the UFO in the movie, and she, along with Richard Dreyfuss, was led to Devil's Tower, where they had face-to-face contact in the movie. But what many people don't know is she has actually had a close encounter. She was interviewed by Timothy Greeneckley and revealed that she had an amazing encounter while staying along the California coast in Malibu, which is a huge UFO hotspot. She had a little apartment overlooking the ocean one evening. At the time, she was in a lot of pain. She was quite ill. And apparently she may have actually been healed by the ETs. And I'll just let Melinda describe in her own words what happened. As Melinda says, "There was this orange light out over the ocean. I stared at it for a while, and it was as if it was saying to me, 'Come with us, come with us.' Mentally, I said I wouldn't. I told them to go away and leave me alone. But I stood in the window for more than an hour." Again, at this time, she was in such intense pain that she was, quote, in her own words, nearly paralyzed. But while she stood at the window, she said, "There was very little pain. It was very soothing." And she also felt that there was, quote, "communication between them and me." So this may have actually been a healing encounter, which certainly isn't unique. And again, Malibu is a huge UFO hotspot. But what's really interesting about this encounter is this was right before, literally 2 weeks before she got the starring role in one of the most famous UFO movies of all times, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So maybe not a coincidence at all that ETs reached out to her. It's very interesting. Another very famous celebrity who apparently had a UFO encounter is the controversial talk show host Morton Downey Jr. He's very much like Jerry Springer type, very controversial talk show host. And during one episode about UFOs on his show, he was actually hypnotized by UFO researcher Gene Mundy and revealed a UFO encounter in which he actually not only saw a UFO, but was apparently taken on board. He was removed from the stage and hypnotized, and filmed during this whole hypnosis session. This was in 1954, and he was driving on a Boston Post road. And as Morton Downey Jr. says in his own words, and I'll just quote brief snippets of what he said, "I was a young kid. I had to get to Boston for a convention. It was late at night, and I'd been driving for 2.5 hours. I'm outside of Hartford, Connecticut. We don't have big roads. We just have this 2-lane Boston Post road. And I'm driving along, and there is this star to my right, and it's always right outside the window of my car. I drove 40 to 50 miles with this star. Must be an airplane, but it's moving with me. I'm driving, I'm zigzagging, and now this star is in front of me. There's an overpass, and I see this fog coming down over this overpass. Must be a fog patch. It's right over the bridge. I hit the fog, and my lights are going down. My car is stopping by itself. I turn over to the side so I can get off the road. I'm in the dark except for this gray, pulsating light." At this point, he heard a voice which said in his head, telepathically, "You have nothing to fear." He gets a little nervous and tries to get out of the car, but is unable to open his door. He can't open his window or his vent. He tries to start the car, it won't start, and he keeps hearing this voice saying, "You have nothing to fear," over and over again. He says at this point, the hair on his head and on his arms is standing up, and he's very confused when all of a sudden he says, "My whole vehicle is being picked up off the road. I don't feel any motion. I'm just being lifted off the road. I don't see any faces. I don't feel any touch, but I keep hearing a voice. You have nothing to fear." At this point, he felt a strong pain in his chest, and he wondered if he was having a heart attack or an anxiety attack. He kept hearing this voice, "You have nothing to fear." All he could see was this fog. He had a sense of timelessness. Next thing he knows, his car is being gently placed back on the road. As he says, "I see the pavement and the swirling as the fog, as it starts to pick up. Automatically, the car starts to go on. My window rolls down. I look at my watch. It's now 10 minutes to 2. I leave and I drive further up the road. I'm tired. I'm probably hallucinating. When I check into the cabin, I have to wake up the manager. And the guy in the cabin, his watch says 1 time, and my watch says 43 minutes less." And at one point during this hypnotic session, he did actually see faces. He said he saw this cone of light, and he saw, quote, "many beautiful faces." So this was actually played live on the Morton Downey Jr. show. And it was funny because during this whole hypnotic session, there was a disclaimer going up on the screen saying that Morton Downey doesn't really believe he was abducted by aliens. So all this time he's talking about being sucked up into this craft and seeing faces and then being gently placed back on the road and having nothing to fear and so forth. There's this disclaimer repeatedly flashing on the screen saying Morton Downey doesn't really believe he's being abducted by aliens, while he's saying he's being abducted by aliens. So he kind of backpedaled this whole story a bit. But what's interesting is his story matches very well with other people's accounts. So did he or didn't he? I'll leave it to you to decide, but he's certainly one of many celebrities who have stepped forward making claims to have been taken on board a UFO or had face-to-face encounters with aliens. Another celebrity who's very well known, who has also claimed to have had a UFO encounter, is Fran Drescher. She's a comedian who is best known for her starring role in The Nanny, a very successful sitcom. And Fran Drescher, who has now stepped forward and said that she believes she was actually abducted by aliens, she and her ex-husband. She says, it's funny because Peter, her ex-husband, Peter and I both saw aliens before we knew each other, doing the same thing, driving on the road with our dads. We were both in junior high. A few years later we met and we realized that we both had the same experience. I think that somehow we were programmed to meet. We both have this scar. It's the exact same scar on the exact same spot. Fran Drescher's ex-husband has denied this. He says that Fran has her own story and he has his, but he's not so sure that he was abducted by aliens. But Fran is not backing down. Pete told her that the scar was actually her scar was from a burn that she had received. And Fran doesn't buy that. She thinks that's a screen memory. As Fran says, I said to him, that's what the aliens programmed us to think. But really, that's where the chip is. So yeah, she believes she's been abducted and implanted by ETs. Interestingly, just recently, Fran Drescher was chosen to head the Screen Actors Guild. So a very high-profile celebrity who is claimed to have a UFO encounter. Another very famous celebrity who has had a UFO encounter is Chad Everett. He's probably best known for his role on the TV drama Medical Center, but has starred in a lot of movies, including a UFO movie, and including the hit comedy Airplane 2. And Chad Everett went public with his UFO sighting on the talk show Vicky when he was promoting a alien movie that he was in starring Marky Post. And this encounter he had occurred in October of 1993 or thereabouts. And as Chad Everett says, in his own words, there were 3 of us, and we were looking out from the Beverly Hills location over Malibu. We faced that way. We could see that way. Now at a distance, which we measured to be about a yard by our arms, how many miles that would be far away from the beach? Lots, right? We tracked a light that was going bump, 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 bump. He moved his hand side to side to illustrate this sort of darting-like movement. And as he says, and you could track it. It was making turns like that. Nothing I know of moves like that. We called and we were told, oh, there's some helicopters on maneuvers. But Chad Everett doesn't buy that for a second. As Vicky asked him, a helicopter doesn't move that fast. And Chad Everett replied, no, of course not, of course not. No craft that we have could track that fast at that time and make turns like that. So yeah, Chad Everett has seen UFOs. Another person who had an incredible UFO encounter is one of the gentlemen who starred on the hit TV sitcom or drama MASH. And this celebrity is none other than Jamie Farr, who was probably most famous for being a cross-dresser on the show MASH. He played the role of Klinger, and he had an incredible UFO encounter in the 1960s while driving through the Arizona desert. They observed this light zigzagging at very high speeds. As they watched, it stopped in midair, it hovered, then took off again, and at one point approached very closely to them, about 300 feet away from their car. Jamie Farr was driving down the highway at about 60 miles per hour and said that this UFO actually paced their car. And it was so close they could see what appeared to be a dome with a light at the base of this craft. And this object got so low to the ground at one point it actually stirred up the dust below on the desert floor. Jamie Farr's wife, Joy, wanted to pull over, but Jamie was too frightened and insisted on driving. And at one point the UFO took off at high speed and vanished. Before this encounter, Jamie Farr says he was a skeptic, but is now convinced that UFOs are real, and says that following this incident, his vehicle never worked quite the same afterwards. Many celebrities to go through. We're now up to the F's, and another celebrity is musician Lupe Fiasco, who says he believes he had an actual face-to-face encounter and was implanted by the ETs. This occurred in the early 1990s when he was just a little boy. He was 11 years old, living in Chicago, Illinois. He woke up early in the morning to find himself bathed in this blue light. And he says he felt like his whole body was being shocked by some type of electricity. It was around 7 in the morning, and looking out the window, he saw this black disc flying in the sky. As Lupe says, "I believe I had an encounter with aliens. I believe they implanted something in my left leg down by my Achilles tendon. I've got a scar there that wasn't there the day before. I never saw it until after my little encounter with beings from another planet." So, yeah, he's very famous as a rapper, and now he's also famous for being one of several celebrities claiming to have been abducted and implanted by extraterrestrials, what he called extra-worldly visitors. Another celebrity who claims to have had UFO encounters is Glenn Ford, who's probably best known for starring in several Western movies in the 1950s. And he had an incredible encounter in Oxford, England. As Glenn Ford says in his own words, "I was trying to relax, taking it easy, so I decided to spend a few hours alone on a beach near Oxford, England. All around me, as far as I could see, was nothing but a beautiful blue expanse of sky and water. Suddenly, my attention was attracted to an object skipping across the heavens. Looking closer, I saw what was definitely a disc-shaped object, what they call a UFO, or flying saucer. I watched it for a good half hour as it darted back and forth right in front of my eyes. There is no way anyone can convince me what I saw wasn't some kind of intelligently controlled craft. This thing made sharp angle turns that our fastest and most advanced military jets could not accomplish at the time." So he is absolutely convinced that this was a genuine UFO, and ever since then has been very interested in this subject. As he says, "Scientific evidence now exists which proves that thousands of inhabited worlds can thrive throughout the cosmos. I'm positive that there are other worlds nearby that contain life forms of one type or another." He did actually report his encounter to the military, and he felt he needed to do that out of a sense of duty. But he was not happy with how they reacted. As he says, "Unfortunately, they would not take me seriously. In fact, they acted as if I was a bit crazy." Glenn Ford believes these UFO visitors are friendly, piloted by creatures coming to Earth for the reasons of, quote, simply out of curiosity. All right, and our next celebrity is none other than Ace Frehley, who is the guitarist for the rock band Kiss. And Ace Frehley was interviewed by Timothy Greeneckley and revealed a really incredible encounter. As Ace Frehley says in his own words, and I quote, "It was very strange. We were flying from Los Angeles to New York. This happened sometimes before the end of July 1974, following the recording of our second album. The flight had been delayed 6 hours, and by the time we boarded, it was well after midnight. I took a seat in the rear section of the 747, isolating myself from the rest of the group and the few passengers who were traveling this late at night." He says at one point during this flight, he was overcome by, quote, an eerie feeling. He was trying to stretch out and get some sleep in this darkened airplane when he noticed a bright ball of light outside the window to his right. And he blinked his eyes, trying to make sure that it wasn't an illusion, and it wasn't. As Ace says, sure enough, this thing was still there. I couldn't make out any great detail. I couldn't make out any great detail. It looked like an enormous baseball, and its actions were completely erratic, moving from side to side. The UFO remained in view for a brief period of time and then darted off, traveling quite rapidly. I know it wasn't a satellite or another plane. We were pretty high up when it appeared, leading me to conclude it was a UFO. Timothy Greeneckley asked Ace Frehley how he felt about the sighting, what was his emotional reaction to it, and Ace replied that he was actually elated by it. As he says, I'd always wanted to see a flying saucer. Lots of musicians have seen UFOs. Another is Robert Fripp. He's the guitarist for the band King Crimson, and his sighting was quite brief. Robert Fripp was visiting the Stonehenge area in England when he saw, quote, a brilliant ball of light go streaking across the starry sky. So it was a brief sighting, but he's absolutely convinced it wasn't a conventional aircraft. Actually a group of musicians who saw a UFO are the Gin Blossoms. They've had a number of huge hit songs, and all of them saw a UFO at one point. Jesse Valenzuela, Bill Lean, Robin Wilson, Scotty Johnson, and Scott Hessel. And as one of the members of the band, Jesse Valenzuela, says, we're recording the song that turned out to be our first single, Follow You Down, and one of the guys in the band stepped out to smoke a cigarette. He looked up and saw a couple of flashing lights or something, so we all went out and took a look for about 20 minutes, and there you go, a UFO sighting. So yeah, the Gin Blossoms are joining the ranks of famous people who have seen UFOs. Another very famous musician who claims to have had a direct UFO encounter with apparent ETs is Sammy Hagar, who really needs no introduction. But he had an encounter at a very early age. He was around 4 years old when he saw what he thought at the time was, quote, a car with no wheels. As he says, we lived out in the country, and I saw this thing floating across a field, creating this big dust storm. I threw rocks at it, and I don't know what happened after that. So apparently he had missing time. This is what the interviewer asked him. And Sammy Hagar replied, I guess. I just have no memory of it. and that it wasn't a dream. It was during daylight. Sammy Hagar said that he had initially been reluctant to talk about his alien encounters because he really felt that there were no words that could express what had actually happened to him. It was very hard to explain. As Sammy says, I couldn't talk about it because I couldn't explain it. But now I'm pretty sure it was a wireless situation, either a download or an upload. They were tapped into my brain, and the knowledge was transferred back and forth. I could see them and everything while it was happening. There was a visual involved. You know how big the universe is? It's freaking huge. If we're really the only ones out there, that's scarier to me than thinking there are aliens. My opinions about the UFO stuff, I could write a whole book just devoted to that. I love it, man. I'm into it deep. So the interviewer asked him point blank whether he believes he's been abducted by aliens, and Hagar replied, I think I have. He wrote about this in his autobiographical book, Red, My Uncensored Life in Rock. And he talked about being contacted by aliens in the foothills above Fontana, California. As he says, it was real. Aliens were plugged into me. It was a download situation. This was long before computers or any kind of wireless. Looking back now, it was like they downloaded something into me, or they uploaded something from my brains. Like, see what this guy knows. If you talk to UFO researchers, they're very familiar with what people call downloads, where ETs will connect with people telepathically and exchange information, giving them messages or recording their own memories. So this is apparently what happened to Sammy Hagar at a very young age, and beyond that. So perhaps the ETs knew he was going to be a very influential musician, or were programming him in some way to become successful. Hard to say, but I think there's definitely a theme going on here because so many celebrities have had these encounters. Another person you may not have heard of, but who is really famous, is Dick Haynes, who is a singer and actor from the 1950s. He was part of the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra, and he had an incredible encounter in 1971 while traveling from New York to Spain on a flight. And it was before daybreak in the very early hours of the morning, and his airplane was just approaching the airport in Madrid, Spain, when he looked out the window and saw, quote, an oblong object, like a bullet, which seemed to be flying parallel to our course. Dick Haynes happened to have a pair of binoculars with him, so he quickly pulled out the binoculars and looked at this object through them, and as he says, it was gigantic, almost twice the size of our jet. I've never seen anything like it. It was completely streamlined, no wings, no tail, or markings visible on its light gray body. After watching it for just a few moments, it quickly darted away. He called the attention of the stewardess and told her about it and asked her if she saw it. And she said yes, she had seen it. And he asked her if she minded going to the captain into the control room and asking them if they saw it. And she obliged. She went and approached the captain in the cockpit and the co-pilot and navigator and asked them if they saw it, and came back and told Dick Haynes that yes, the pilot and the whole crew also saw this UFO. And Dick Haynes said that several other passengers on the airplane also saw it. So this was a mass sighting. Many people saw it, and they were all convinced it was a genuine UFO. Another person who claims to have had face-to-face contact with ETs is Jimi Hendrix. He obviously needs no introduction, But Jimi Hendrix and his whole band actually had a major encounter during a snowstorm in upstate New York. Jimi Hendrix never went public and sort of kept it secret, but his bandmate Curtis Knight eventually did go public and talked about this. This occurred one evening in 1965. It was 4 a.m. in the morning, snowing heavily, and the band had been driving for about 100 miles when they realized they must have missed their turnoff, and they became entrenched in a deep snowdrift. It actually was so deep it reached up to the hood of their vehicle. They were unable to go forwards or backwards, and they turned the heater up and had no choice but to wait until morning. But it kept getting colder and colder, and they realized that they were in actual danger here. I mean, they were in danger of losing their lives, getting frozen to death and snowbound. And this is when they had an incredible encounter. Suddenly, according to Curtis Knight, the road in front of their car suddenly lit up very brightly, and looking upwards, they saw this glowing object that was, quote, cone-shaped, like a space capsule. It actually came down and landed right in front of the car. Curtis Knight was driving. Jimi Hendrix was next to him. And as Curtis says, at first we thought it was an apparition caused by the cold and our confused state of mind. I mean, we just couldn't believe our eyes. Now, Jimi Hendrix had seen UFOs on previous occasions, and Curtis Knight knew this. So he looked to Jimi to see his reaction. And as Curtis Knight says, Jimi didn't answer but sort of smiled. He seemed to be staring out into the night, his eyes riveted on this thing, resting within a stone's throw. Knight turned to the other band members, but they were all strangely asleep, and he shouted at them, but they would not wake up. So they were perhaps entranced or hypnotized or put to sleep. This is something we do see in particularly close-up UFO encounters. So it was just Curtis Knight and Jimi Hendrix who saw this when suddenly a door opened in the craft, an opening, and this figure appeared and began to glide towards their van. And this figure was very tall, as Kurt Knight says. He stood 8 feet tall. His skin was yellowish, and instead of eyes, this creature had slits. The forehead came to a point, and his head ran straight into his chest, leaving the impression that he had no neck. As they watched, this figure floated towards the van, and to their amazement, this creature, this figure, caused all the snow to melt all around their van. And Curtis Knight looked at Jimi Hendrix, who was looking straight at the figure. And as Curtis Knight says, Jimi seemed to be communicating telepathically with it. So as this figure is in front of the van melting the snow, they started to warm up quite quickly. As Curtis Knight says, suddenly I was roasting. This figure actually circled around their van, melting all the snow completely around it. As Curtis Knight says, as it glided behind our truck, I saw that the drift had completely vanished. Turning on the ignition key, I gunned the motor and got the hell out of there. The object, the strange craft, was at the same instant lifting off like a rocket from a launching pad. So there you go. They had a face-to-face encounter not only with a UFO, but with a UFO occupant. And Jimi never went public. He wanted to keep it secret. As Curtis Knight says, Jimi never did talk much about what happened. He sort of let me know that the cool thing to do was not bring up the subject. It was to be our little secret. However, from what he did say, I sort of suspect that the object arrived to save our necks, chiefly because Jimmy had been practicing trying to communicate by ESP with the beings on board. I know this may be hard to believe, but I'm putting it straight, just like it happened, you hear? And it should come as no surprise that several of Jimi Hendrix's songs actually talk about UFOs and aliens. For example, one of his songs is Up from the Skies, which is actually written from the point of view of an ET who has come back to visit Earth after a long absence. I just want to quote the song lyrics briefly because they're pertinent. The song begins, I just want to talk to you. I won't do you no harm. I just want to know about your different lives on this here people farm. So this is something that we often hear directly in UFO contact cases. And in the song, the ET goes on to say that he has come back, quote, to find the stars misplaced and the smell of a world that has been burned. Well, maybe it's just a change of climate. So again, here's that theme of nuclear proliferation and climate change and upcoming environmental disaster and upheavals, which is again a very strong message from the ETs. So yeah, perhaps Jimmy was in direct telepathic communication with these beings. It certainly seems so, and it's not the only case of people who have been rescued or healed by ETs. And a lot of celebrities. Another celebrity who you probably have heard of is Jill Ireland. She's a pretty famous movie star. She starred in the movie Shane, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. She was married to Charles Bronson, and she went public with her UFO story. She told Timothy Greeneckley all about it. As she says in her own words, my youngest girl was only 3 months old at the time. I remember it was about 5 in the afternoon when we had the sighting. I was sitting on the veranda holding the baby in my arms. Our child's nurse, Zizi, was standing around talking to me when suddenly my eyes drifted to a bright blue patch of sky. Something up there, which had been reflecting the rays of the sun, caught my attention. So this thing glared so brightly, she couldn't really tell exactly what shape it was or what size it was, but she's pretty sure it was, quote, round, with perhaps a dome or tower on top. But it was such a bright sunny day, and it was reflecting the sunlight so brightly that she couldn't really tell. And she thought at first, could this be a weather balloon? But she ruled that out when this object began to rapidly rise higher and higher and flew against the wind. And she wonders if maybe it was a secret government aircraft or a genuine UFO. She's not sure, but whatever it was, she felt like it came down and paid her, quote, a brief visit. And Charles Bronson, her husband, absolutely believes her and supports her account, saying that she would never lie about something like this. A more recent celebrity musician who has come forward saying he has had a UFO encounter is Nick Jonas of the Jonas Brothers. And he was on Late Night with Seth Meyers in 2015 when he revealed that he had had an encounter when he was just a teenager. As Nick Jonas says, when I was 14, maybe, I was in my backyard playing basketball with some friends, and I looked up in the sky, and there was 3 flying saucers. He turned to his friends and says, are you seeing this, or am I losing my mind? And his friends backed up his claim. They also saw this strange object. And he later researched it and found that there was a similar sighting just 2 weeks prior to this. So perhaps that was related to what he saw. At any rate, it absolutely convinced him that UFOs are real. As he says, I'm a firm believer in aliens. Another famous celebrity who has seen UFOs is the actress January Jones, who rose to fame largely in the drama series Mad Men. And she had a really interesting encounter. She revealed it on Jimmy Kimmel. Jimmy Kimmel asked her, "Are you into aliens and stuff like that?" And January Jones said, "Very much," and revealed her own experience of a UFO sighting. She said she was out in a field in Iowa when she saw this UFO. She was about 22, maybe 24 years old, and she saw this light in the sky making weird movements. As January Jones says in her own words, "I was in a field, I saw a light in the sky, and it went shoo, 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 like it made a shape, and then whoosh." It was definitely a spaceship. So she actually, gestured, showing how this object darted along and then whooshed across the sky. And she added, well, maybe it was a shooting star that just couldn't figure it out. But no, she's absolutely convinced she saw a genuine UFO. She says, "I saw it. I didn't imagine it. It was real." There was another person who was in the car near her, but he did not see it. But she absolutely saw it. And she talked about this on the Jimmy Kimmel show to Jimmy Kimmel. Another person who has recently gone public with her sighting is Khloe Kardashian, who said, and I quote, "I did see a UFO. It was years ago, and I was driving my Hummer at the time, right? We were driving, and I saw one. We were driving by the Sepulveda area in the San Fernando Valley, and I told Malika, and she didn't look up fast enough, and I saw a UFO." More recently, in 2021, I was actually personally contacted by the Kardashian producers for their show, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, and we did a little Zoom meeting. They wanted to talk about UFOs and how to contact them, and I gave them a little information on the area of Malibu where they live, which is a UFO hotspot, and told them about the CE5 protocols, or how to contact a UFO using meditation and lights. And I instructed them to just go out late at night and telepathically call down a UFO, bring a flashlight, blink it up into the sky, and you might be surprised. You might have a sighting. And they actually did this. They followed my instructions, and to their shock, they actually saw this orb-like object, which was white and then blinked red, and it totally freaked them out, her and her boyfriend, so bad that they jumped up and ran back inside. So yeah, Khloe has had 2 UFO sightings, and one is very recent. Another very famous celebrity who has had an encounter is Kesha, who's a very famous and award-winning musician. And Kesha said that she was absolutely, totally sober when she saw a UFO up in the area of Joshua Tree, California. And she says, "I was, quote, a totally sober Sally, just a lady in the desert. I look up in the sky, and there's a bunch of spaceships." She estimates she saw maybe 5 or 6 of these objects, and they disappeared and reappeared in a new formation. And she says, "I was like, those are effing aliens. They were spaceships." So she didn't go into a lot of detail, but yeah, Kesha saw multiple UFOs up in the Joshua Tree area, which is also a fairly well-known area for UFO activity. Another musician who says she has seen UFOs is Alicia Keys. She's won a number of awards for her singing and songwriting, and doesn't go into detail about what she saw, but makes it clear that she not only believes in ETs, but has seen a UFO herself. As she says, haven't all of us seen something flying in the sky? And it's at some random time of night that doesn't make sense, and it's not the shape of a plane. So yeah, Alicia Keys joins the ranks of UFO witnesses. And along with her is talk show host Jimmy Kimmel. Jimmy Kimmel, while interviewing January Jones, admitted that he and his friends also had a UFO sighting. As he said to January Jones, "If it makes you feel any better, I feel like I saw one too in a similar situation. I was with my friend Tony and my cousin Sal. We were fishing. We were up in the Sierras here in California. We looked and we saw something go a little bit weird." He made these darting motions with his hands. And he says, "Just like you said. We had been smoking though, so it was a little bit different. But we mutually saw it though." Another celebrity is Lemmy Kilmister. Lemmy Kilmister is a popular rocker from the United Kingdom. He was the lead singer for the very popular group Motorhead. And late in life, he went public as a UFO witness. He said that he was in Rio in 2011 and said that he saw a UFO, a ship, cruising over the top of a mountain. He said it was moving at an unbelievable speed. He estimates it was about 1,000 miles per hour. And he has mentioned this several times. He's confirmed over and over again that he does believe in aliens and that he doesn't have a problem admitting it. Another very famous UFO witness is comedian Robert Klein. And Robert Klein says that he had a sighting in the summer of 1957 when he was 15 years old, and he was attending a youth camp in Kent, Connecticut. He and 25 or so fellow campers were playing baseball when this UFO arrived. As Robert Klein says, in his own words, "Before I knew what was happening, a group of my buddies were craning their necks skyward, pointing excitedly at something. Following the direction of their stare, I immediately saw what had captured their attention. There, in plain view, were these 6 cigar-shaped objects moving by at an extremely high altitude. They were in formation right behind the other, traveling in and out between the cloud layers. Strange as it may seem, they made absolutely no noise. I mean, not a sound. They were just coasting along as if they hadn't a care in the world." These objects were pretty high up, so they couldn't really make out any detail. But as Robert Klein says, "But because of their great brilliance caused by the reflection of the sun, we could definitely ascertain their shape as being elongated. They went out of viewing range after several minutes. How something this size could travel at such great speeds and not make any noise is beyond my understanding. They defied all the laws of physics." Robert Klein admits that he is definitely not an expert on UFOs or aircraft, but says that he has never seen anything like this before or since, and it impressed him so deeply he felt compelled to report it to a nearby Navy base. And to his amazement, they took his call very seriously and told him that they had received a number of other reports at the same time. And later, they called him back, the Navy called him back and offered the campers an explanation, and which Robert Klein later learned is really, quote, par for the course. So the Navy tried to debunk it, but Robert Klein is absolutely convinced he saw a UFO. As he says, I strongly believe there is a rational explanation for the majority of sightings, but there's also quite a bit about which we know nothing, and a lot of that remains unexplained. I must, in all honesty, put my own UFO sighting into this category. Another super famous person who I'm sure you've heard of, who has seen UFOs and possibly aliens face to face, is none other than John Lennon of the Beatles. John Lennon has professed his strong interest in UFOs. He went public with his sighting, which occurred on August 23rd, 1974. At the time, he was separated from Yoko Ono and was in a relationship with his assistant, May Pang. And he viewed this UFO from his 53rd Street penthouse apartment in Manhattan. And were out on the balcony when this UFO showed up. He saw it first, and he screamed out to May to come out onto the balcony and looked. She ignored him at first, but finally came out there. And as May Pang says, I walked out onto the terrace. My eye caught this large circular object coming towards us, pulsating as on any of the aircraft we'd seen heading for a landing at Newark Airport. But it clearly wasn't a normal aircraft, because as they watched, this thing approached to within a few hundred feet. And they said it was huge, about the size of a jet, but was totally silent. As May Pang says, when it came a little closer, we could make out a row or circle of white lights that ran around the entire rim of the craft. These were also flashing on and off. There were so many of these lights that it was dazzling to the mind. John estimates its size at about as large as a two-man Learjet. There was no sound, no noise coming from it. As they watched, this object scooted away and disappeared from view, but then a few minutes later it came back, and they quickly grabbed their camera and tried to take a few pictures. Unfortunately, they did not come out, but they were impressed enough to call both the newspaper and the police. And both the newspaper people and the police officers said that they had received numerous calls from other witnesses reporting this object. And according to May Pang, John Lennon was deeply affected by this sighting and just kept saying, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. I've seen a flying saucer. As May Pang says, John has always had an interest in UFOs. He even used to subscribe to a British UFO magazine, the Flying Saucer Review. But after seeing what we saw that night, he became even more fanatical, bringing up the subject all the time. He told her that he would like to be taken up inside of one. And here, John Lennon actually describes his sighting in his own words.
Over here, up there, I saw a UFO, and it went down the river, turned right at the United Nations, turned left, and then down the river. It wasn't a helicopter, it wasn't a balloon, and it was so near.
And it looked what, sort of round, white, luminescent, and silent?
Silent, and it looked dark, like black or grey in the middle, and had white lights, just looked like light bulbs, you know? Just going off, on, blink, 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 round the bottom, and on top was a red light.
If you see a little note on walls and bridges, it says, I saw a UFO. And I was just finished doing walls and bridges. I'd mastered it or done the last tape of it. And I was really just relaxed and feeling good. And it was summer in New York and I had the window open. And lo and behold, there was this thing just hovering sort of 100 yards away. But I saw it so close, it wasn't in the sky or nothing, you know. And it was like I could have hit it with a brick if I'd thrown a stone at it. I couldn't see the colours because it was dusk. It was a good, clear summer night. You know, the sky was very clear. And round the bottom of it were just ordinary-looking electric light bulbs, blinking off and on alternatively, like on a billboard or something. And on the top of it was a red light. And the thing I noticed was that there was no noise, and I could hear that freeway down below, all the cars going. So I realized, oh, it's not a helicopter, then it must be a balloon. But it was so close to the rooftop that it couldn't be a balloon. So all the rational things I went through, not a helicopter, balloon. Not a balloon, it's too close to the roof, and it's maneuvering too well to be a balloon. So I just watched it, and it was there for about 5 or 10 minutes. It went off down the East River, and there it was, and that's all I got to say about it.
John Lennon also wrote about his sighting in a song called Strange Days Indeed, and one of the lyrics says, "There's UFOs over New York, and I ain't too surprised. Nobody told me there'd be days like these." According to Uri Geller, Uri Geller had a face-to-face conversation with John Lennon and told him that at one point he saw what looked like bug-like creatures coming into his room and freaking him out, and gave him this little silver egg-like object, which he gave to Uri Geller at some time before John Lennon was assassinated or murdered. So whether that part is true or not, I don't know. This is a claim coming from the famous psychic Uri Geller. Some people have disputed it, so I don't know. But what is clear is John Lennon had a very close-up UFO sighting and very possibly face-to-face contact with ETs. And he's not the only one. As I said, ETs love musicians. And another who has bravely stepped forward is Demi Lovato. In fact, she's now starring in her own series on UFOs. It affected her that profoundly, her encounter. And she went public in October of 2020 about making contact with extraterrestrial life forms, and actually shared some photos and videos, which she says are, quote, just some of the evidence from under the stars in the desert sky that can no longer be ignored and must be shared immediately. And she said she's had encounters of UFOs in broad daylight, and has had actually a number of sightings. She said, another day, another UFO sighting, as she's pointing her video camera up at the cloudless blue sky where two bright white orbs of light are seen. And she's kind of narrating the film and says, wow, what the F? They're coming. And she's absolutely convinced she's not only seeing UFOs, but is in contact with them. She's hooked up with Stephen Greer, the famous UFO researcher. And as Demi Lovato says, over the past couple of months, I have dug deep into the science of consciousness and experienced not only peace and serenity like I've never known, but I also have witnessed the most incredibly profound sightings, both in the sky as well as feet away from me. This planet is on a very negative path toward destruction, but we can change that together. If we were to get 1% of the population to meditate and make contact, we would force our governments to acknowledge the truth about extraterrestrial life among us and change our destructive habits, destroying our planet. It took me several sessions to tap into a deep enough level of meditation to make contact. Happy communicating. So yeah, she's saying that she's actually in direct communication with ETs. Who's to say? It's happening to a lot of people. One actor who's been talking about this forever is, of course, Shirley MacLaine, who's starred in too many movies to even count, and has won multiple awards, and became very famous for her belief in spirituality and UFOs, and wrote a best-selling book called Out on a Limb, where she talked about talking to a channeler and seeing UFOs herself. As Shirley MacLaine writes about one sighting, yes, we went to Mexico to Mount Popocatépetl because they were having so many UFO sightings. And we don't know really why, but we saw them, and he did too. And she says she's seen UFOs on a number of occasions. UFOs, spaceships, darting around in the night sky, darting across the heavens. She believes they're intelligently controlled devices that have been visiting here for centuries. She believes they're friendly and mean us no harm, and has had a lot of mystical experiences, actually. And she says that actually when she was in her home in Taos, the presidential candidate Dennis Kucinich also saw UFOs while visiting her in her home in Taos. So yeah, another celebrity who's seen UFOs. And here's another group of musicians who have seen UFOs, and this is the band Moody Blues, a super successful band composed of Denny Lane, Mike Pinder, Ray Thomas, Clint Warwick, and Graham Edge. And they were driving outside of London one evening when something very strange happened. Suddenly, they noticed there were no cars on the road, and all the night sounds of the animals, the crickets and so forth, had gone completely silent. And that's when, as they say, quote, a fat cigar with a low protrusion on top with 7 red lights on it appeared. The upper half of this object appeared metallic, whereas the lower was red and pulsed from left to right. It acted most peculiarly. So they watched it for just a few moments and realized that this was not a plane, and sort of panicked, and overcome with fear, they drove off very quickly. Another very famous sports star who claims to have actually been abducted by aliens is Guillermo Moreno. He's a very famous soccer star from Argentina, and he says that he missed practice because he was actually taken on board a UFO for, I believe it was 3 days. And he was sort of outed by one of his teammates. He did not directly say this himself, but he hasn't denied it. But according to his teammate, Guillermo Moreno said that he was taken on board a UFO, and that the ETs actually took him out of his body, removed his soul to actually run tests on it, and were very careful to cause him no harm. This was revealed by his teammate Gustavo Lorenzetti. And according to Gustavo, and I'm quoting Gustavo here, he explained that they take out your soul, analyze it, and all the while on the journey they are looking after you. He said something like that. Honestly, I believe in aliens. He gave a great explanation, and we'll have to believe him. So other type of channels will have to call him so he can tell it better. But in any case, he was abducted by aliens. And Guillermo Moreno does not deny this and says, quote, I left and I came back 2 days later because I was kidnapped by aliens. Another very famous sports star who claims close UFO contact is Baker Mayfield, football player for the Cleveland Browns. And he received some ridicule for going public with his sighting, which is very recent actually, March 3rd, 2021. And he says he 100% saw a UFO with his wife, Emily. And he revealed this in a tweet in which he said, M and I just saw a UFO drop straight out of the sky on our way home from dinner. We stopped and looked at each other and asked if either of us saw it. A very bright ball of light going straight down out of the sky towards Lake Travis. Anybody else witness this? I'm a firm believer in UFOs and Sasquatch. It's real. And his wife, Emily Mayfield, also confirms this and writes, I will not lie. I am sometimes not somebody who buys into UFO speak. However, all I do know is I noticed one thing tonight that I've by no means seen, and I'm a little bit thrown off. So many celebrities. Now we get to another celebrity, an actor by the name of Casey Musgraves. And she had a very interesting close-up UFO sighting while in Mexico. As she says, I've seen UFOs. One was in Mexico, and I was with several other people. I was on the beach after my friend's wedding after midnight, and it was the craziest movement of light in the sky. All of us watched it for like 20 minutes. It changed shape. It flew across the sky. It did wacky stuff that nothing normal would do. I was completely sober, swear to God. And it wasn't long before she saw another sighting. It was actually just a few days later. She says, 4 days later, I was in Nashville on the porch at night, and out of the corner of my eye, looked over in the sky, and hovering over the neighborhood were two giant balls of fire just floating along. First I thought it was a helicopter, but it was being controlled. It was crazy. And she had a third UFO sighting in 2014 over LA, in which she saw tiny dots of light in moving in a triangular pattern. So yeah, Casey Musgraves believes she's seen UFOs on at least 3 occasions, and absolutely believes they're real. As she says, I'm definitely a believer. I don't think we are alone. Another mega famous celebrity who's seen UFOs is singer and actress Olivia Newton-John, the star of the cult movie Grease. And she talked about her encounter, which occurred when she was just a little girl at age 15. She saw a UFO flying at, quote, amazing speeds. She said it was absolutely a real UFO, a silvery object speeding through the sky, and ever since then has been absolutely fascinated with all things extraterrestrial. As she says, it's true. I'm intrigued by them. I have seen one when I was very young. It was unidentified and it was flying. In England, most people now think UFOs are possible. 20 years ago, how many people would have thought that? But yeah, she says this object was bright, bright silver and moved at what she called, quote, amazing speeds. Another person who is so famous and really needs no introduction is Shaquille O'Neal. And he has also recently gone public with his own UFO sighting. And he's absolutely serious about it. As he says in an interview, you know what's crazy? I never told anybody this story. This occurred in 1997 while he and a group of friends were on their way home from Hollywood Video in Madera, California. And as Shaquille O'Neal says in his own words, right when we passed the fairground, I could swear I saw a flying saucer come down with all the lights, and it was spinning, and then it took off. Everything happened in less than 5 seconds. And we all looked at each other and were like, I know it was a UFO. I don't care what anybody says. Case after case, I'm telling you, many celebrities have seen these things more than you know. Another musician who has gone public is Post Malone. And he had a really interesting encounter, which he talks about in his own words in quite some detail. As he says, I've seen one. I was probably 16. I was in upstate New York, and it would just stay there. He revealed all of this on Joe Rogan's show in 2020. And as Post Malone says, I was looking out the window with my cousin, and it's just a light that just stays there and then just effing goes off. I mean, you can't explain it. And that wasn't his only sighting. He had another one when he moved to LA. He says, and I quote, I used to live in Tarzana, and it looked like, it sounds corny, but like a classic force field. It looked kind of like a dome in a circular shape. It was looking down at the city. And I'm like, how did no one else see this? But I was like, there with like 4 other people, and they saw it too. So he wasn't alone. There were other witnesses, and he is now a confirmed UFO believer and one of many, many celebrities who have stepped forward and talked about his sightings. Another person who went public with his sightings, to some degree at least, is Elvis Presley. He never spoke publicly about him, but he did grant an interview to an author by the name of Luckman and revealed a very strong UFO connection. And according to Luckman, a very strange incident happened on the day Elvis Presley was born, January 8th, 1935. A strange, unidentified blue light hovered over Elvis's home in Tupelo, Mississippi. According to Luckman, and I quote, the light was seen by the doctor who delivered him and by Elvis's father, who later told Elvis all about it. And Elvis's hairstylist also heard about this directly from Elvis's father. And as Larry Geller, Elvis's hairstylist, said, his father told us he'd gone out to have a cigarette at 2 a.m. during the delivery, and when he looked up into the skies above their little shack, he saw the strangest blue light. He knew right then and there that something special was happening. And Elvis was very much known to be interested in UFOs and talked about it to many, many people. And also told Larry Geller that he had seen UFOs on a number of occasions. Once he saw a pair of bright lights in the sky, bright objects out in the desert. And another time he saw UFOs over Graceland. And actually at one point apparently had direct contact with ETs and communicated with telepathically. This is according to Luckman. And reportedly, Elvis Presley was visited by these ETs who communicated with him telepathically at age 8 and gave him a glimpse into his future. And they actually showed grainy images of him as a full-grown man wearing a white suit and singing before a large crowd of people. At the time, Elvis had, quote, no idea what it all meant at that time. And only later, when he became super famous, did he realize that the ETs had actually shown him a prophetic glimpse of him as a very famous singer. So yeah, maybe they are setting this up, like Sammy Hagar and so many other musicians. They do seem to have a very strong interest in musicians. And another very famous group where most of the members have seen UFOs are the Rolling Stones. Mick Jagger says that while camping out in Glastonbury in England in 1968 with his then girlfriend Marianne Faithfull, Mick Jagger described what he saw as a, quote, cigar-shaped mother ship, and it was floating among the stars. And also said he had a second UFO sighting during a really famous concert at Altamont, and that these sightings left such a strong impression on him that he ended up installing a UFO detector at his home in England. And he claims to have had other encounters. Another band member who says that he's seen UFOs is Mick Taylor, who was a former drummer for the Rolling Stones, and says he saw a UFO in Warminster, England. This was during a time where there was a wave of sightings over Warminster. And Mick Taylor says he saw a huge pulsating object so bright that it illuminated a herd of sheep on a nearby hillside. And 2 other more distant UFOs were also visible. And a third member to claim to have seen UFOs is Keith Richards. As Keith Richards says in his own words, "I've seen a few, but nothing that any of the ministries would believe. I believe they exist. Plenty of people have seen them. They are tied up with a lot of things, like the dawn of man, for example. It's not just a matter of people spotting a flying saucer. I'm not an expert. I'm still trying to understand what's going on." And Keith Richards believes that actually at one point UFOs landed near his home. Another actor who saw UFOs more than once is Ronald Reagan, who starred in Bedtime for Bonzo. He was a pretty well-known actor and later became governor of California and then president of the United States. It's definitely one of the most famous UFO witnesses of all times. And according to Reagan's pilot, Bill Painter, they encountered a UFO when Reagan was governor. As Bill Painter says, "I was the pilot of the plane when we saw the UFO. On board were Governor Reagan and a couple of his security people. We were near Bakersfield when Governor Reagan and the others called my attention to a big light flying a bit behind my plane. It appeared to be several hundred yards away. It was a fairly steady light until it began to accelerate. Then it appeared to elongate. Then the light took off. It went up at a 45-degree angle from a normal cruise speed to a fantastic speed instantly." And at one point, Reagan did actually mention this publicly to a reporter, to Norman Miller, who was the Washington bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. And Reagan told Miller that after sighting the object, he ordered Bill Painter, the pilot, to follow it. And as Ronald Reagan is quoted saying, "We followed it for several minutes. All of a sudden, to our utter amazement, it went straight up into the heavens. When I got off the plane, I told Nancy all about it, and we read up on the long history of UFOs." The reporter Norman Miller was surprised to hear Reagan talking so candidly about this. And and Norman Miller asked him point blank if Reagan actually believed in UFOs. And that's when Reagan realized that he had actually spilled the beans, perhaps a few more beans than he had intentionally meant to spill. As Norman Miller says, "When I asked him that question, a look of horror came over his face. It suddenly dawned on him what he was saying, the implications, and that he was talking to a reporter. He snapped back to reality and said, 'Let's just say that on the subject of UFOs, I'm an agnostic.'" Later, as president, Reagan would give several provocative statements pointing towards the reality of UFOs. Once in 1985, he said, "If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species from another planet, we'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our two countries, and we would find out once and for all that we really are all human beings on the earth together." 2 years later, in 1987, he again made a very provocative comment, saying, "In our obsession with antagonisms of the moment, we often forget how much unites all members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bond. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside the world." And he made a third quote in which he reportedly said, "What would happen if the world faced an alien threat from outer space? Don't you think the United States and the Soviet Union would join together?" So I'm not sure if it's an alien threat or if he was just trying to put forth the alien threat narrative. But Reagan absolutely has gone public with this UFO sighting. And according to some sources, it's more than a sighting. According, I believe it's Lucille Ball who revealed at a party that Reagan told her that they were driving along the Pacific Highway when he was an actor and had a face-to-face encounter with ETs who told him to get out of the acting and to get into politics, and that he would one day be the president of the United States. I don't know. This is a third-hand story. It's hearsay, but for what it's worth, this is a story that is circulating around within the UFO community. Next celebrity we get to is Buddy Rich. You may not know him, but he's a very, very well-known drummer. And he had an incredible sighting in 1954 in Atlanta, Georgia. And as Buddy Rich says in his own words, he saw, quote, 2 brilliantly illuminated objects come out from behind the dark side of the moon. We stopped the car in the parking lot of the club to get a better look. The objects were now doing figure 8s in front of our bulging eyes. It was as though they were playing tag, engaging each other in a game of cat and mouse. They made incredible turns at highly accelerated speeds. Under normal circumstances, the resulting G-forces should have crushed whoever was on board. 200 people saw it at a club. The local Air Force base said they got 500 calls. So yeah, that was a very well-viewed sighting in 1954. And it was 12 years later he had another sighting that was even closer. This was in 1966. Buddy Rich and his wife were driving between L.A. and Las Vegas when he says, and I quote, "Suddenly I received the jolt of my life. There, zooming down out of the heavens, was this thing. It was 40 feet in diameter and shaped like a disc with a slight dome on top. The outside rim was glowing, sort of pulsating, red, blue, white. It made 3 passes over their car, and on the second pass went right over their roof, very close, then darted away. As Buddy Rich says, it went up like a bullet and was out of sight in a matter of seconds." And he also points out importantly that this object made 0 noise, no sound whatsoever, even though it was quite close. All right, another actor who had seen UFOs is Cliff Robertson, who won an Academy Award for his portrayal in the movie Charlie of a man who was mentally handicapped. And this was taken from the book Flowers for Algernon, a very famous book by Daniel Keyes. And at any rate, Cliff Robertson has gone public with his sighting of a UFO in July of 1963. It occurred at 3 p.m. He was on the observation deck of his home in Pacifica Park, which overlooks the Southern California coast. And as Robertson says, "Suddenly my eyes were diverted toward an object high in the sky. Whatever it was traveling from south to north and sparkling like a diamond as it reflected the rays of the mid-afternoon sun." He tried to explain it away as a plane or a helicopter or a balloon, except it was clearly none of these things. It was moving very strangely and looked even stranger. And he grabbed a pair of binoculars and verified that this was definitely nothing he's ever seen before. As Cliff Robertson says, "By no means was I prepared for what I saw through the binoculars. Instead of supplying me with a rational explanation, it only convinced me that no identification was possible. I've been a pilot for years, and I have to be honest and say, never before have I encountered anything remotely like this during my experience as an aviator. There in front of me was a weird alien contraption, a cylindrical-shaped craft made of highly polished metal. He watched it for about 10 minutes before it finally moved away. As he says, it just hovered out there, high up over the water. Then boom, all of a sudden it was gone. It disappeared in a twinkling of an eye. It was definitely a UFO, like so many other people have seen around the world. I was awed by its sleek design, its trim appearance, and the fact that 1 minute it could hover on a dime and the next blast off into space at fantastic speed. I don't know of anything built on this planet that could maneuver in such a fashion. And now we get to another celebrity. This time it's a sports star by the name of Aaron Rodgers, who is a footballer for the Green Bay Packers. And he said he saw a UFO in 2005, just before he entered the NFL. He was on the East Coast for a pre-draft interview when he and his friends heard a siren outside, and they went outside and were stunned by what they saw. As Aaron Rodgers says, it was a large orange left-to-right moving object. Because of the overcast nature of the night in the snow, you couldn't make out. It was behind the clouds we were seeing, but it was definitely large, moving from left to right. It was me, Steve, and his brother that saw it, and it goes out of sight, and we look at each other and go, what in the F was that? At the time of his sighting, there was a couple of other things that Aaron Rodgers pointed out. One was that he was near a nuclear power plant, and the other was that jet fighters appeared shortly after and apparently began to chase after this object. And as Aaron Rodgers says, now, if you know anything about UFO sightings or you've done your research, you know that a lot of times two things are connected to UFO sightings. One is the presence of fighter jets, and two, there's a lot of sightings around nuclear power plants. So to tie it all together, the alarm we heard from 30 miles out was a nuclear power plant that had an alarm that went off. Next celebrity I want to talk about is Lillian Roth, a hugely famous movie actress from the 1940s. For example, she starred in the Marx Brothers movie Crackers. And she has had a really incredible series of sightings. As Lillian Roth says, I doubt if anyone else would take me seriously. After all, how do you prevent people from laughing out loud when you tell them you've sighted a spaceship that was as large as the Hindenburg dirigible? Her sighting occurred in 1951 while she was traveling from New York to California, and she saw this object. She was outside when she says, quote, I caught a glimpse of something that rocked my senses. There, as if suspended from some invisible thread, was a tremendous object, shaped like a child's top. It was huge, perhaps 150 feet in diameter, standing perfectly still. It remained in one position, hovering at what would be the height of a 15-story apartment building. When it got directly overhead, I remember thinking, is this thing going to fall on me? The UFO had a metallic body, similar to aluminum. All around the hull were small portholes or windows which were lit up with different colored lights. They were red, white, green, blue, and orange, each shining forth with its own sparkling brilliance, adding to the effect of dazzling and beautiful color. Lillian Roth says that this object hovered for about 5 minutes and then shot up. As she says, it rose very high in the sky, appearing as a small speck in the deep blue above. And then suddenly it dropped down again, real close, and then darted away and was gone. The whole time it was totally silent. And 1 year later, she had another sighting in Florida. This was 1952, while she and her husband were driving to a club, when, as she says, as if from nowhere, they saw this huge cigar-shaped object. It was hanging just above the horizon, directly above their car. It was as big as the Hindenburg and surrounded in this pinkish haze. And she says, as we watched, the great ship faded away, just simply vanished into nothingness, hard as it may be to believe. So they went to the club, stayed a while, and drove home, and to their shock, they saw it again. It was as she says, the same or an identical UFO loomed up above the horizon, reaching out majestically with its pinkish velour body gleaming softly into the heavens. They're just trying to prove to us that they're really out there. Yeah, I think that's probably true. They're putting on what amounts to a publicity campaign. And in fact, this is what happened to Kurt Russell. Kurt Russell is hugely famous, married with Goldie Hawn. He starred in the movie Overboard and a million other movies and TV shows, and had an incredible sighting. He was actually one of the witnesses to the Phoenix Lights in 1997 or 94. And he was flying at the time, and he saw this bank of lights in the shape of a triangle near the airport that he was flying into. And as he says, I was flying my son Oliver to go see his girlfriend, and we were on approach. I saw 6 lights over the airport in absolute uniform in a V shape. Oliver said to me, I was looking at him, I was coming in, we're maybe a half mile out, and Oliver said, Pa, what are those lights? And then I kind of came out of my reverie and I said, I don't know what they are. He said, are we okay here? And I said, yeah, I'm going to call in. And I reported it. And what's amazing is he did report it, but the whole sighting strangely left his mind. He sort of forgot about it, and this really puzzled him. He didn't think about it for a long time until his partner, Goldie Hawn, and he were watching a report on UFO sightings, which depicted the Phoenix Lights, and they were listening to this description of this giant triangle. And this is when Kurt Russell suddenly remembered that he himself was a witness to the Phoenix Lights. And it shocked him. And he remembers turning to Goldie and saying, wait a minute, that's the night I was landing in Phoenix. So yeah, there is a weird amnesia aspect to UFO encounters. I'm not saying he had missing time, but this sort of thing does happen. People can absolutely forget even a simple UFO sighting and not remember until they're suddenly prompted. And that's apparently what happened to Kurt Russell. Another very famous person who's seen a UFO is Shawn Ryder. He's a singer-songwriter from England and part of the group Happy Mondays. And Shawn Ryder was 15 years old when he first saw a UFO. He was working as a messenger boy for the post office and was walking to the bus stop on Hilton Lane in Little Hilton. It was 6:45 a.m., still dark, when he looked up into the sky and saw something he couldn't explain. As he says, at first it was still, and then it went voom, and then again voom, a classic zigzag, hovered, and then went off at like 10,000 miles an hour, like Star Trek. Boom, gone, yeah. And it was a short time later, just a few months later, in 1978, that he had another sighting. And this was around 5 p.m. when he saw a gigantic fleet of UFOs. As he says, hundreds of lights going across the sky really slow. And I'm thinking, God, we're being invaded. And the next day in the papers, it said, mysterious lights in the sky. Lights at Salford Rugby Ground have gone mad. And that was bull, because when the lights at rugby grounds started moving around, it's nothing like these. So he has ever since then been obsessed with UFOs and absolutely believes that he is a witness, and he gets really angry at people who think he was imagining, or as he says, off his head when he saw them. But he says, no, he's actually seen these things, and that anytime he's seen anything otherworldly, he was 100% clean and sober. Another very famous singer who saw UFOs is Neil Sedaka, world-famous singer-songwriter, who owns a home in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. This is a pretty heavy-duty area for UFO activity. And there was a lot of sightings going on. And early one Sunday evening, Neil Sedaka and his son were playing outdoors when they saw something very weird in the sky. And as Neil Sedaka says, there, moving slowly but steadily across the sky, was what appeared to me at first to be nothing more than a shooting star. However, in subsequent action, it convinced me that this object was no ordinary aircraft because the behavior, the movement of the UFO was erratic. This object would accelerate, decelerate, turn at right angles, and they watched it for long enough to know that this wasn't a satellite or plane or anything conventional. And after just a few minutes of observation, they strangely lost interest. And this object was actually still cavorting around when they returned inside. And Neil Sedaka did grant a recorded interview to Timothy Greeneckley, but never really talked about it publicly because, as he says, some people are still prone to laugh, though the number of skeptics are getting to be fewer and fewer in number. All right, moving along. Another very famous actor to see UFOs is William Shatner, who also granted an interview to Timothy Greeneckley and talked about an amazing sighting he had in the Mojave Desert. And he was out there motorcycling with his friends when, during the day, when he had an accident, hit a hole and fell off of his bike, and the bike fell on top of him, and he lost consciousness. And he woke up pretty much quickly, but could not get his motorcycle started as hard as he tried, and realized that he was in trouble because this was, the Mojave Desert. It was a blazing oven. And he says that when he woke up under his motorcycle, he thought he heard a strange sound or felt something, saw something. And it sort of gave him energy. And Beckley pressed William Shatner for further details, and Shatner replied, "Putting this into simple words is not easily done. It was more of a sense, a feeling, a shadowy phantom. All I know is that I suddenly felt better." So he woke up, got the strength to push his bike, and at some point felt like he was being led out of the desert. As William Shatner says, "By this time I was doing what I was feeling. One could say I was doing what I was told to do, but I was just doing the easiest possible thing. Fantastic as it may seem, the motorcycle appeared to have a way of going on its own." And at one point he saw a figure off in the distance, which he assumed was another motorcyclist, and it gave him the courage and the strength to keep on walking. But when he got to that point, there was no sign of the figure, but he did find this gas station. And it was then that he saw a UFO. As Shatner says, "It was then, off in the distance, I saw an object glinting in the heavens. I don't know if it was a flying saucer. I can't state for certain it wasn't. I don't claim I was being led out of the desert by some mysterious force. All I've told you are just the facts." So he's leaving open the possibility that this may or may not have been a UFO. As he says, "It's possible that's what happened. Merely one of the explanations. I don't wish to go overboard. Better to understate something of this nature. However, the whole experience was real enough and happened as I told you. I will let you make the interpretation." So, there you go. Star Trek star sees UFO. Another actor who saw UFOs is Elke Sommer. She was very famous in the 60s and 70s, or the 70s rather. She's a German-born actress and says that she saw a UFO in November of 1977 while standing in her backyard. It was about 10:30 when she saw a glowing reddish-orange sphere floating very low by some trees about 150 feet away. She said it was 20 feet in diameter. It hovered for just a few moments at the height of about 100 feet, and then began to move slowly towards her and descending even lower until it was only about 25 feet, maybe 50 feet off the ground. And she ran inside her home to get her husband, and together they ran outside, but by this time it was gone. Another celebrity to claim to have had UFO encounters is Sting, the very famous musician. And in his book, Alien Rock, Michael Luckman, who also wrote about Elvis, said, and I quote, "Sting is eager to learn the truth about UFOs and the origin of the crop circles, particularly the one that mysteriously turned up on his property. Together with a friend, Sting witnessed a UFO while on a skiing vacation in Switzerland. They saw what looked like the top of a mountain lit up like a Christmas tree. The light then sped away at high speed. Sting's wife Trudy discovered the crop circle on the couple's estate, in the same area where most of the crop circle formations have appeared." So yeah, Sting has seen a UFO and apparently believes they landed near his home. And some of his music and music videos actually do reflect this. For example, the video in Sting's song, "I'm So Happy," shows little dancing gray aliens, the type that's well known in the popular culture. All right, moving along. Another musician who's not super well known is Jim Sullivan, who's a country rock singer, and not super famous perhaps, but did enjoy some success. And in 1969, he released an album called UFO. And it didn't do so well, but in 1975, he tried his luck in Nashville and eventually left L.A. one day and drove his VW Beetle to Santa Rosa, New Mexico, and checked into a hotel. And this is when something strange happened. He disappeared. His car was found 26 miles away, and Jim Sullivan was never seen again. His family and many others believes he may have been abducted because he often talked and sang about UFO encounters. And in his car was his guitar, something that his family and friends say he would never in a million years have left behind. So perhaps he was taken into a UFO, and that's where he is today. This is not unheard of. There are cases where people have been abducted and not returned, though it is apparently quite rare, though maybe not. There are a lot of missing people, and Jim Sullivan is perhaps just one whose fame allowed us to learn about this case. All right, another witness to UFOs is the actress Bella Thorne, who starred in a number of movies such as The Duff or Shake It Up. She's not only an actor but a singer as well. And in an interview with the Huffington Post, she talked about her own UFO encounter. As Bella Thorne says, "We were driving to Disneyland and we saw this really weird circular thing in the sky. It had lights and it was freaking us out. And then all of a sudden we could not find it in the sky. And it really freaked us out." So yeah, a brief sighting, but one of many by celebrities. Another musician who has seen UFOs is Mel Torme, who says that one evening in 1953, at around 2 a.m., he stepped out of his Manhattan apartment on 61st Street to walk his dog, Spooky, and looking up, saw this red light flying around in strange patterns. And he thought, could this be a balloon? But it clearly wasn't, because it was illuminated, and then it did something no balloon could do. As Mel Torme says, "It moved horizontal, faster than my eyes could follow it, before stopping dead in its path as though it had hit a barrier. And then it did lazy loops, like a figure 8. Next it made a few more circles, and then noiselessly it went zap again to another part of the sky." Mel Torme estimates it was about 5,000 feet up, and he could just make out, quote, a strange saucer-shaped craft of unknown dimensions behind this powerful red glow. And he looked down at his dog, and his dog also was looking at it and stood there, quote, totally transfixed and shaking. And after a few more minutes of maneuvering around totally silently, this object zipped off into the sky faster than he could follow. Mel Torme is absolutely convinced he saw a UFO. He's a pilot, by the way, and familiar with aircraft. He admits it could have been government, but he doesn't think so, because as he says, nothing I know of that we have could move about so quickly and yet make absolutely no sound whatsoever. All right, moving towards the end of our list, there's just a few more. The next UFO witness and celebrity is musician and drummer Ronnie Vannucci Jr. Vannucci is best known for being the drummer of the hit rock band The Killers, and he had an incredible UFO sighting in the Nevada desert. As Vannucci says, I was driving to the middle of Nevada on Route 95 North, and I saw this red dot in the sky, almost like a laser pointer. Kind of red, but it was bigger, and it was doing all these motions, like normal flight patterns, and then it would zip down and go really quick. I pulled over. I didn't have a phone at the time, and I tried to radio people, and no one heard me. Then it went behind this mountain range, and it was 6 at night, so the sun was going down, and there was this giant flash of light afterwards, like a strobe, and it was gone. It was crazy. I am not making any of this up. And in 2008, Vannucci contributed to the writing of the 2000 hit Spaceman, and the song begins, it started with a low light. Next thing I know, they ripped me from my bed, and then they took my blood type. It left a strange impression in my head. So who knows, maybe he's hinting he's actually been taken on board. At the very least, he had an incredibly impressive UFO sighting. All right, we now just have 4 more celebrities to cover, and the next celebrity I'd like to talk about is Ray Walston. Ray Walston rose to fame as being a star in the sitcom My Favorite Martian. He actually played a Martian, ironically enough. He also continued to act throughout his life, and in fact had a very well-known role in Fast Times at Ridgemont High as Mr. Hand. At any rate, he was a stage and screen actor, and in the early 1960s saw a UFO in his home in Beverly Hills, California. He said it was about 3,000 feet high and kind of shaped like a bathtub. It had an aluminum-like surface, and he watched this object as it darted around and suddenly shot away and out of view. Another UFO witness is punk rocker Helen Wheels. She was one of the pioneers of the New York punk rock scene and composed several songs for the very famous musical group Blue Oyster Cult. She has gold and platinum records testifying to her achievements. So yeah, she's very well known. And she's also gone public as a UFO abductee. It was one Saturday morning or afternoon, it was around noon in June of 1961. She was 12 years old, and she and her younger brother, Peter Robbins, who is now a very well-known UFO researcher, they both saw 5 objects in the sky high above their Rockville Center, Long Island home. And instantly the objects zoomed down and hovered right over the 2 children, and they could both see these were metallic craft. They formed a V formation right over the house across the street. These were silvery white disc-shaped objects. And Peter was 14 years old. Again, Helen was 12 years old. And they became frightened and ran towards the house. And at this point, Peter Robbins completely forgot about the UFOs, just left his mind. He said time seemed to move in slow motion when this beam of light came down and struck him. And he was unconscious before he hit the ground. And meanwhile, Helen was staring at these objects, and she experienced a period of missing time. And next thing she knows, she's watching this much larger UFO scoop up the 5 smaller craft, and it darts away. And at that time, they didn't quite understand that they had missing time, but once they realized what missing time meant, they realized that they had probably been taken on board. Peter Robbins, Helen Wheel's brother, went under hypnosis but wasn't able to recall anything. But Helen did go under hypnosis as well. She recalled being hit by this beam of light and taken into a craft. And as Helen Wheels said, I was in a small, round, dark area, and a tall being came and got me. For some reason, I wasn't really afraid of him, as he kept reassuring me through messages in my mind. Taking my hand, he led me into a control room in which there were all sorts of dials and meters and lights, kind of like a cockpit. She was placed inside a chair and shown this television-like screen that showed the blackness of outer space filled with bright stars. According to Helen, the ET was about 6 feet tall, with a large bald head, large dark eyes, and grayish skin, and he wore a metallic one-piece jumpsuit. And the whole time he stood right next to her, was very friendly and mentally reassured her. She was then taken to another room. She was put on a table and examined by shorter-looking gray-type ETs. And as Helen says, something very painful was shoved up my nostril to the extent that it put a hole in my nose and blood poured out. And the next thing she knows, she was being returned via a beam of light to her home without any memory of this onboard encounter. So she's still dealing with the after effects of this abduction, and as she says, I felt totally violated, as if they had proceeded against my will, and for this reason I do not know if I can ever completely trust them. Another celebrity who's gone who didn't actually go public, but apparently gave an interview about his encounter is Stuart Whitman, who has done a lot of movies. And this actor, Stuart Whitman, apparently had a sighting during the Great New York Blackout on November 9th, 1965, while on the 12th floor of a Manhattan hotel in New York City. And he says he was woken up just before sunset by a whistling noise right outside his room, and looking out he saw 2 UFOs. And I'll just quote Stewart directly. As he said, one of them was orange and the other was blue. They gave off a strange luminescent light so that I couldn't see if there were portholes or who was in them. Then I heard them speaking to me as if they were on a loudspeaker. They spoke to me in English. It may not have been audible to anyone else. I was probably tuned to the right wavelength. They said they wanted to talk to me because I appeared to have no malice or hate in my soul. They said they were fearful of Earth because Earthlings were messing around with unknown quantities and might disrupt the balance of the universe on their planet. They said that the blackout was just a little demonstration of their power and that they could do a lot more with almost no effort. It served as a warning. They said they could stop our whole planet from functioning. They asked me to do what I could to fight malice, prejudice, and hate on Earth. And then they took off. I felt elated. I wasn't even shocked. I was standing by the window and awake the entire time. I don't know why they picked me as a contact, but I'll swear off a Bible that I saw them out there and that they talked to me. So here we have again these common themes of a UFO display and these warnings against war and aggression and nuclear power and environmental collapse. Very interesting. And now we get to our final celebrity, Robbie Williams. Robbie Williams is an actor and a singer, and he gave an interview on a television news show, in which he very seriously talked about his UFO encounter while on a ranch in Utah. And the details are kind of sparse on this one, but apparently he saw this object come down out of the sky and hover directly overhead, so close that he could have hit it with a tennis ball. Unfortunately, the guy who interviewed him kind of joked about it and didn't take it so seriously, and so we don't have a whole lot of details about it. But yeah, it was apparently so low that it was within a rock's throw distance. So I'm not so sure that this is a coincidence. I think they probably did it on purpose. And it might not also be a coincidence that Robbie Williams has written some songs that are sort of very influential in talking about the world. And like his song Advertising Space, which is all about the best and the worst of humanity's existence. So there you have it. That's more than 70 celebrities who have seen UFOs, actors, singers, sports stars. I didn't even get into politicians because this video would have just been too long. And that's enough, I think, to convince people that UFOs display very little prejudice on who they contact, and in fact probably appear to contact people who are doing good for humanity, people who are influential, people who can get the word out and talk about them. They are putting on displays. They want people to know that they exist, and they want us to know that we are on the verge of destroying our own planet. And that, I think, is why they went to actors and musicians and sports stars in particular in an effort to let people know that they are real and that they have a message they are trying to share with all humanity. And I think this is important. And that's the real reason why I wanted to do this episode. So that's it for now. Hope you're having a great day. Thanks once again for watching. I really appreciate it. And until next time, keep having fun.